Okay, kick off. So firstly, welcome everyone. It's great to be here in person. It's great to be here at a Ruby event, and it's a delight to have you all present. We are Open. We are a gifting company with a particular eye for quality and performing said gifting activities at absolute scale. We have the fortunate position of working with some of these lovely customers, and at the start of this year we took on some investment, so we're on a growth trajectory. 7 million specifically I was told to mention, not that matters, but you know we're here and we're growing as a team, and we're a Ruby on Rails house with React.js on the front end, and so sure, yeah, hello. Does that help? So we're a Ruby on Rails house. We use React.js on the front end and so on, and we're very proud of this. And this is exactly what we're investing in. You know, we're growing the team, and you know we're building some great product. I'm not going to labour the point on exactly what we are, but last week we had our MD at Web Summits presenting on the main stage. So if any of you are interested in learning a bit more about what we do, how we do it, etc., I'd invite you to check that out. So the subject of the talk tonight now is about Blazor. So my colleague here, John, is going to take over in a second and talk you through all of this. But fundamentally, as a growing company and as a company that handles gifting at significant scale for some of these companies, we handle a lot of data. Like we're tracking from all the gifting intent, from all the requests to gift people through to you know, invites going out the door, you know, all the communications to the intended gift recipients, all of their interactions with our platform, and from there, all of the activity that happens in the real world in terms of conveying real world gifts all the way through to the recipients. There's a huge amount of data that we're collecting, and as we scaled, we found that obviously the need to interact with that data, to understand that data, to answer queries for support reasons, for analytical reasons, for business reasons, was just growing all the time. And naturally we needed to be able to kind of service those queries and do so in a way that actually helped us to scale as a team, because fundamentally the responsibility was falling on the engineering team, on the software developers and so forth, and we were going into the database, we were going into the Rails application, we were going to the Rails console, we're running queries, trying to turn around answers for people and so on, and this wasn't really that scalable, it wasn't really efficient, and it wasn't a great way to share. So these were the kind of problems we were wrestling with, and you know, when you have these type of problems, and I'm sure many of you have already solved this problem in different ways, you naturally turn to a BI type tool, and that's exactly.
Hold the microphone a bit closer to your mouth.
Closer to my mouth. I see. Apologies. So when you have these type of problems, it's exactly when you turn towards a BI type tool, and that's exactly what Blazor is. Blazor solves a lot of these problems in ways that John will describe in more detail. Was that up closer again? It's going to be in my mouth in a second. So where was I? Blazor, yes. Yeah, Blazor solved a lot of these problems for them. We got a lot of value out of it, so we're here today to talk about that, exactly what it is and what it's helped us to do. So I'll hand over to John now to take over, please, and hold the microphone closer than I did.
At least by your mouth, John.
Yep. Can you hear me? Okay. So yeah, a little bit about Blazor. I hope nobody Googled Ruby Blazor, because you probably would have got a lot of fashion websites and things like that. But no, Blazor is a BI tool that we've managed to get a lot of use out of in Open. So here's a kind of it's very hard to see in the screen, but it's a kind of a visual demonstration of Blazor in action. It's a dashboard of gifting metrics that we can control the dates that we want to view the data over. You'll see big counts, charts and things like that can be done as well, various types of charts. But essentially what Blazor really is it's an engine that you can mount onto a Rails application, and it gives you a bunch of these features that are really useful. And in the background, really all it is just a bunch of open source things. So it's Vue.js, jQuery, Bootstrap, and a bunch of other open source projects. And again, to talk a little bit more about Blazor itself and what it solves for us, Fintan touched on a lot of it, but when you gather a lot of data and you have, you know, obviously people want to know about what does the data tell us. A lot of these questions came to the engineering team, and what we could have done, and what a lot of engineering teams would do, is start to build features to service the request, even internally. And that can be challenging because you're building a product focusing on a vision, So all these things can kind of, I guess, pivot you in different directions away from what the core vision of the project is, or the product is. And Blazor allowed us to kind of bring a tool onto our application, give us a window into our data, and then start to share these pictures about the data with our team internally. And it's been super. So what I'll cover first is I'll cover about how the very basics of what Blazor is and what it can do and how to get it set up. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of saw what Blazor had and kind of extended it a little bit more. Has anybody used Blazor before or heard it? Great. Some people are familiar. So the first half you'll probably be maybe familiar with, but hopefully the second half will be a little bit more interesting. So these slides are probably going to be hard to see, so we'll definitely share them after the talk. But this is just a setup slide about how it's quite easy to set up Blazor. You just add it to your gem file, run a couple of commands to generate some installation files, run a migration to generate the Blazor database tables, mount the engine, and set up a connection to the database. One of the nice things about Blazor also is that it's using a separate connection to what your application uses. So you can use a read-only connection, obviously for security reasons. So it has really two kind of protection mechanisms. The connection is a read-only connection, and also it does a rollback after every query. So it's quite useful. And it has really good documentation as well on the gem. So one of the first things about Blazor is that it's essentially a quite useful SQL ID. So it does involve engineers kind of getting a bit familiar with SQL, which sometimes with Rails people, they kind of drift away from it, but this kind of brings you back front and center, I guess. But it does make you kind of appreciate the kind of the power of SQL and what it can do, and when you really kind of get involved, it's really, really a useful tool. So this is kind of what a query would look like in Blazor, and you can see that over on the right hand side it has some controls. You can update a query and delete them, but also what's nice with Blazor is that you can fork a query. So what that means really is when you have a query that you want to kind of build on, but you don't want to alter the one that's there already, you can fork it and start to build a brand new query that's based on the one that you just used. So it's quite useful in that process can really help you kind of generate different types of queries and just kind of change them slightly to kind of get different views on the same data. And one of the really kind of useful features of Blazor is this thing called smart variables. So by definition, if you just created queries and they were static, they're useful, but not really useful, because you want queries to have some sort of dynamic aspect. You want them to run over different time frames. You might want them to have some sort of a filtration on a specific type of attribute in the database. So Blazor facilitates that using smart variables. So you can configure variables yourself that you want to use, but also these ones that are built in like time variables. So you can filter over a start time and an end time, and that becomes dynamic. And you then have a control that allows you to flip windows of time to look at the data over different windows. So that control aspect and that dynamic aspect of the query is really useful. And you'll see here this for example, is automatically showing us a date picker, and we can control the window that the data is shown over, so it's quite useful. In terms of query permissions, it's quite a basic permission model. Queries without a name are not listed. Queries that start with a hash are listed only to the creator, and queries that start with a star are only editable by the creator. So it's quite a basic model, but it's useful enough in that it gives you that control about the visibility and the access of the queries. It supports a bunch of different visualizations. This is just an example of a couple of them. Essentially what it does is it based on the type of data that's being returned in the query, it's going to automatically do a graph. So if it detects that the data being returned from the query is counts and timestamps, it will automatically do a line graph. It can do pie charts, mapping data as well is pretty useful, and stuff like cohort analysis and various types of columns and scatter charts. So it's quite useful, and there's quite a nice array of types of visualizations you can do. One of the nice things about Blazor then as well is when you have a set of visualizations, you can group them in a dashboard. Which is useful because we've done this quite extensively, in that we'll create a bunch of queries on maybe a certain team sending gifts, or maybe about a campaign or various aspects, but you want to group lots of charts together. So Blazor allows you to group them all together, which is pretty useful, because then you can create a kind of a holistic view of something and then share it with your team, so it's quite nice. Blazor also has some alerts, which is also useful as well. So if you want to be notified of a specific situation in the database based on the data, you can do that too. So if you detect some strange data state in the database, or you want to detect that, you can have a check that will run. What's nice as well is it has some kind of basic anomaly detection. So if you have a line chart, for example, that looks fairly predictable, and then all of a sudden you have a spike somewhere, you can get alerted for those kind of scenarios as well. And it supports Slack alerts as well, which is pretty useful because you can have also emails up, but Slack is nice as well because you get the instant alert. And the nice thing about these alerts is that it sends two. So if you look at this example we have here, it's a stock alert. So we've created an alert to detect when our stock might be a particular low level. So the alert will send to your Slack directly when that threshold is breached, but also when the threshold is fixed again to tell you that the problem is no longer there. Blazor also has some kind of forecasting aspects. So if you have a chart and you want to kind of attempt to predict what it might look like in the future, it can also do that as well and have a very kind of a basic forecast of what the data might look like in the future. And that uses an external tool called Profit that you can also add to Blazor as well. Another interesting feature of Blazor is that you can upload data directly to Blazor. So if you have data that is not inside your database, so you're getting it from an external source, but you want to combine it with what you have in your database, you can actually upload it, and the CSV file then will be turned into a database table, and you can actually use that database table then to run queries joined or connected with your data that you have in your database. So it's quite interesting that you can connect data from various sources. And then another interesting aspect of Blazor is that it supports a bunch of different data sources. So the traditional one that we would use and most people would use would just connect it directly to your application database, but it supports 20 plus different connectors of various sources. So you could connect to things like Elasticsearch or Google BigQuery or Salesforce, meaning that you can create a connector and directly then you can query these external sources. And we actually created our own adapter because one of our applications is actually a multi-tenant application. So we have different schemas based on our customers. A traditional connector, like a Postgres connector, would actually just query the public schema. So for us, we actually created our own. So we were able to have a connector or a data source connector that would actually switch the connection depending on the customer. So it was quite useful. So that's all Blazor stuff. That's all kind of what you get out of the box essentially with Blazor, which is really useful stuff. But as we kind of started to use Blazor a little bit more, we kind of wondered that like everything lives inside of Blazor, and there's a lot of stuff we want to kind of bring outside of Blazor into our application. So we had an idea that maybe we could expose some aspects of Blazor via API that could be consumed by our application. So we came up with an idea to create an extension to Blazor called Blazor JSON API. And essentially, some of the reasons why we looked at this, went down this avenue, is that using Blazor allows us to actually create and adjust APIs without the deployment. So we can actually create an API, iterate on an API very quickly, without any needs to deploy. So that for a team where we have separation between the back end and the front end, that's really useful because it means we can collaborate really quickly, have real working prototypes, work together to make it what we want to do in a couple of iterations, and that requires no deployment, so it's super useful. Again, like I was mentioning, these APIs were super useful. Now, they're really useful for where you want to power, charts and private APIs for stuff that's in-app. That's where we really found it useful. So it allowed us to kind of use Blazor to create these APIs that would power in-app charts, and that's really, really useful for that kind of stuff. Like I mentioned as well, iterating on and quickly creating prototypes is super useful. The variable aspect of Blazor also is really useful in that we can create these APIs that also support URL parameters. So they can have, pagination automatically. They can have filtration params to kind of refine down the API responses. So super useful. And like I mentioned, that basic permissions model that Blazor supports is useful too, because we can hide some of these charts or queries that maybe we don't want to have in the general Blazor space because they're powering charts, meaning that we can kind of control the access and visibility of them. And then also part of the gem that we created is that we can control the response structure of the JSON as well, using conventions in SQL. And this is essentially what we were looking to get to. You can see there's a bunch of different charts, a bunch of different metrics, all powered by Blazor APIs, meaning that, like I said, we could work directly with the front-end guys and come up together with working prototypes that would then power real charts. Super useful. Setup slide again, and probably quite small as well, but just going through the setup steps of creating, of setting up this extension we have to Blazor, where you can essentially use the gem, mount the engine, and configure some authentication aspects. You can configure them directly as HTTP basic authentication, or you can actually use a condition. If you're using device, for example, you can actually just conditionally mount the Blazor API engine. Again, this is probably going to be pretty small, so I can kind of describe what it is, but it's a very simple select a bunch of attributes from a users table. Using the API, if you wanted to fetch this, it would actually just return a very flat structure of a JSON, as you would expect. You get the attributes that you're selecting and a collection response of all the users. Where you want to control it a little bit more, you can apply limit 1, which essentially is explicitly saying, just give me one record, I don't want a collection. And also in the where clause, we can add a variable. So for example, in this scenario, we're adding a variable where username equals a variable username. And that gives us then an API that essentially returns a single record in the response, and we can control the nature of that record using this URL parameter, which is the username parameter. So it's quite useful in that scenario. Where you might not want to have such a flat response, you might want to nest stuff. So for example, you might want to nest a structure underneath a key. We can also do that by using a double underscore into SQL. So for example, you can do a team name with double underscore separating them, and then in the response, that will actually nest it. So you'll have a team, and internally to that structure in the JSON, you'll have name and location, for example. And that you can nest as deep as you want, depending on how many underscores you want to use. Pagination as well is possible using the variable, so you can use a simple limit and offset. Blazor also, which is useful, also supports pagination defaults, meaning you can actually configure defaults in the Blazor config file. And then some requests then will automatically have these defaults applied. So if you look at a simple GET request with pagination defaults applied, it will actually return, it will respect the pagination. You'll get, for example, the first page with the 30 records in it. You can then alter the request by providing the pagination parameter. So it's quite useful in that you can do that kind of flexible stuff with the API. And again, like I said, this was where we wanted to get down, that the extending Blazor to make it possible to expose some of these APIs allowed us to get to this place, so where we have charts essentially powered by Blazor and very easily extendable, and building on the fact that we can deploy APIs without a deploy essentially directly in Blazor. Another interesting use case separate to the API stuff that we try to do a little bit of is something called validated learning. I don't know if anyone ever heard of validated learning or know what it is. Maybe not, but it's essentially, it's quite a simple concept. It's really just where you always measure units of progress very carefully. So it's a bit like where you create a minimum viable product, and you essentially the goal of it is really to learn from what you have. So a traditional approach might be to spend lots of time planning a project, and then spend lots of time going through the execution of it, and then in the end you have a product that you deliver to somebody and it's something they don't want, which is a terrible scenario to be in. Validated learning kind of flips that, in that it focuses on the learning aspect. So every iteration is really an experiment to discover whether the path you're on is correct, and if it's not, then you pivot to some other direction to make sure that you move towards what the desired path is. And why I'm kind of talking about this with Blazor is that you can actually bundle Blazor with these other libraries that makes it a really useful tool to carry out this kind of validated learning. You can use something called Ahoy, which essentially tracks first-party user analytics, Ahoy Email, which tracks first-party email analytics, and then couple that with Blazor, and you have a really useful framework for measuring user engagement in your application, and also emails and things like that you send. When I say engagement, I mean Ahoy will track things like a visit to a website and stored in a database table, and also a stream of events associated to that visit. So it means that you have a very clear path of what the user did when they visited your website. And because it lives in your database as well, you can actually connect it up to all your other data in your database as well. So it's really useful in terms of analytics, because it's all together in the same place. So then, to kind of conclude, the kind of key takeaways, Blazor, lightweight BI tool, easily integrate with any Rails app. You can use SQL then to immediately construct a bunch of charts and dashboards and dynamic reports. At AndOpen, we regularly use it to analyze, visualize data in place and share the output with our teams. And then the other aspect that we've extended this to kind of expose these APIs or these queries as APIs, meaning that we could use it to power some of the more data-heavy charts using these private APIs in our app. So it's been super useful. So yeah, that's pretty much it about Blazor. I think, Fintan, do you want to close out with a couple of things?
Sure. Thanks. Well, I mean, thank you, John. Thank you, John, firstly. I think we'll pause here for any questions anybody would like to ask about anything we just presented.
Question here.
For the Postgres adapter that you wrote, could you change the schema using smart variables, or did you need to post it to different companies?
So essentially, we use a multi-tenant apartment gem. So that, in essence, switches the schema based on the domain. So we built our connector to use the domain also to do that switching schema aspect. So it's not using it's using a variable in that, it's using the variable based on the domain name, but it's not using a smart variable in a URL parameter, essentially. Yeah. Another question?
Does Blazor support connections to multiple databases at the same time, or is it just a single?
No, I think it's a single connection, so it only uses a single connection.
What's the reader only?
Yeah, so the question was, does Blazor support multiple databases connections in a single query, essentially? Is that what you mean, or?
Well, either a single query, or if you can actually specify across different queries, different databases.
Yes, so you can. So essentially, when you're creating the query, you can select the data source you want to apply the query to.
Cool.
So it means that you could have, essentially in the same dashboard, you could actually have Salesforce data alongside your application data, alongside, I don't know, Google BigQuery, all in one dashboard. So it's quite nice like that. Anything else? No? Cool.
Great. Okay. Well, just leaves me to wrap up and say thank you for your attention. As we said, it's great to be here in person, and bar's open. People want to hang around and have a chat. We'd love to talk to you about anything that's on the board or just in general what's going on in the Ruby community at the minute. We also love your feedback about this as a talk, etc. Because we'd love to run a few more events like this in the future and to keep this moving. So it'd be great if you could hang around for a little bit and say hello. There's a good few of our team in the audience, and they're all usually quite nice, so we'll be on the best behavior. And then the last thing to say is, because we're a gifting company, we have actually got you all a gift, so make sure you grab one of these boxes that are just behind Andrew at the back there before you do depart and take it home with you. And Declan, good luck on the bike with that. But thanks very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.